his property. To the one he gave 5 talents, to another, to another one, to each according to his ability, and then he went away. Verse 16, he who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents, and here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little, and I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Verse 22, he says, And also who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little, and I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also who had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my monies with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. It gets worse for this guy. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In the place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. These are God's words. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you today, and we are amazed by this parable. First off, because you were so generous with us to allow us to be people that steward the talents and the things that you have given us. And then secondly, we're frightened because we truly don't know where the line is. We don't know where the line is of selling everything and following after you. We don't know where the line is of really rejecting all of the cares of this world and following after you. It's a hard line for us to kind of think about and focus on. And today we could probably come here a little bit confused. We could come here and be a little bit convicted. And so I pray that this sermon does not point to ourselves and what we can do, but it would point to your Son and what he has done. In your name, amen. All right, so we see through this this parable, and it is a little bit frightening, especially for the guy that had 1 talent, and then he took that talent, the little coin, and he or not the coin, it was actually a sum of money, and he put it into the ground. And Jesus at the end says, the master said, throw him out into utter darkness and take the little that he had and give it to the one that had a lot. And we look at this, especially as postmoderns, as in people that come to this, and we go, this is kind of weird and kind of hard for me to hear. And, if I didn't already believe in this thing called Jesus and Christianity, I don't know if this sermon would be the sermon that would bring me into the kingdom of heaven. You know what I mean? I don't know what this would, but at one level, we've talked about this, parables are just small, feeble stories. There's just these little stories. The power is within the hearer. So this, you could hear this sermon and you could hear this parable, and it could be speaking volumes to you, really like hitting you into a place of saying, man, I need to be or do something more. Or you could just say, no, this is just not talking to me. And I would just ask you right now in your head, ask the Lord and say, what would you have me to learn in this? So we look at this story, and there's this story that is told of Martin Luther, the great reformer. You guys know who Martin Luther is. I've talked about him before. And Martin Luther, one day, while he was hoeing his garden, A friend came to visit and asked what he would do if he knew Christ was returning that very day. So if you could imagine Martin Luther, this kind of monk slash reformer slash guy that really enjoyed going to the bar on Saturday nights and singing songs. I mean, A Mighty Fortress Is Our God. You know that song, A Mighty Fortress Is Our God? A bulwark. You know, that word bulwark, I've always wondered what that word meant. It's just a fortress, right? And it's this big kind of defense line. But he would kind of party and sing songs on Saturday night, and actually, he would only have church services on Sunday nights, actually, which was really interesting. And his board or his eldership kind of came to him and said, hey, Jesus rose early in the morning. You know, he rose up early in the day, and we should too. And he said, fine, 11 o'clock. And that's actually why most people have 11 o'clock services that are in the Lutheran service, because he is like, I'll give 1 hour before it, because he was still kind of, getting over last night and singing all the songs. So he was a German monk turned reformer, got married to a nun who actually used to brew her own beer. That was who she was. So if you could just imagine Martin Luther being a very rough and tumble type of guy. This is the guy that went against the Catholic Church. Very interesting guy. The more that I read things about him, the more I'm like, I can't believe he went against the Catholic Church and transformed a lot of things. But Martin Luther one day is hoeing in his garden, and someone asks him and says, what would you be doing if Christ was returning, right? What were you doing? And Luther is supposed to have answered this. This is what he is said to have answered. He said, I just keep on hoeing my garden. And see, the thing is I've heard this before, and like this is the concept. The concept is whatever you're supposed to be doing, and it's kind of trying to downplay, this question. If you knew that you only had a day to live, what would you do, right? Like, how would you live that day? Would you be more generous? Would you walk maybe a little bit slow? Or would you go fast and try to connect with as many people as you can, Skype with everybody that you can to make this like huge, Skype conference of all of the friends that you know in the world and make sure that they know that you love them and you're proud of them? What would you do if you knew that you only had one day to live? And Luther was kind of coming at this point, and I've heard a lot of pastors use this kind of story of like, well, you should be doing, what God wants you to do. So it's trying to downplay this whole, like, man, I really have to get my priorities in life in order to do these things. But he's saying, well, I'd just probably still be hoeing my garden because that's what God's called me to do in today's work. And that's, at one point, is supposed to make you, feel a little bit better and saying, okay, if God came back tomorrow and I was working at my job, I'd be faithful in what I was doing, and that's a good thing. But there is some sort of balance in there. There's some sort of tension in there that is kind of calling us and saying, how are you living your life? Are you just living life as a pragmatic person or a pragmatic Christian that you go to church on Sundays and you go to a community group and you just do these things because you're supposed to do it, and that's, the bare minimum Christianity, which, what I talk about here is there's no such thing as bare minimum Christianity of what I do. What is the bare minimum of getting me in? Getting me into the kingdom of heaven. And there is not that type of thing. There's always us pushing and saying we want to do more. We want to go further. So we look at this parable, and this parable kind of goes off on a few things, and I would like us to for a moment think of this parable, knowing that the master is Jesus, the master is God. And we see in verse 14, and it says this, again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his property to them. Jesus sets up a plausible story of a master-servant relationship. Of course, it is only the wealthy who could leave home and go to a far country, having servants who would look after the home place and the master's assets. There is, however, no sense that the master is testing his servants. This is too much money for the master to use as a test. See, to look at what a talent is, it refers to an actual measurement of wealth. The master in this parable uses cash, a means of trade increasingly common in the first century in Palestine. 1 talent, this will be helpful, is worth 6,000 denarii. And do you guys remember last week when I was talking about the fair wage of how a denarii, that it was a day wage. So like for how much you would have to have for a day wage, he gave them for one one talent is 6,000 denarii. The one denarius is about a day's labor, thus making the talent worth 20 years' wages. Okay, that's a lot of money. You know, when I hear this story in my Sunday school head, I think of like him giving him like a coin. You know what I mean? I mean, like, you know, it's like this thing, and you know, you give a coin to like the little kid and be like, okay, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to invest it, or are you going to take that little coin and you're going to put it into the ground? You know, what are you going to do? And we think of it like that, but this is 6,000, which is a huge amount of money, being a 20 years of wage. You know, this is like retirement money. It's compared today to around $50,000 to $60,000, which doesn't seem like that much. I don't know how that's 20-year wages. Like looking at $60,000, I'm like, in Montana maybe? Like I don't, But he gives 5 talents. He gives all of these things. But to the guy that he gives 5 talents to, which is 30,000 denarii, that's about $1 million. It's about $1,800,000 in today's wage. And the question that this kind of brings up is this: how can we please the Lord as we wait His return? And when we look at Christianity, and when you look at the things that you could be known for, or bad things that you don't want to get in trouble for if something bad happens to you within Christianity, and you don't want to get in trouble by God, you don't think of not being risky enough. But this parable is saying to be a Christian is to take risks with the wealth and with things that God has given you. Now, see, that's an interesting topic, because we're like, we've always been people that have said it's almost like the sin of commission. If I don't do anything wrong, if I don't do anything bad, then I'm okay. Bare minimum Christianity. If I don't do anything wrong, God's going to let me in and be whatever. But he says, right in the story, he says, it is the sin of omission that I am more concerned about. What is the sin of omission? It is when I fail to do good with the gifts that God has given me. It is when I fail to do good with the gifts that God has given. And so that's an interesting thing, because there's a tension there. It's like, it's almost err on the side of risk and God's grace, then err on the side of keeping your nose clean and taking your talents and doing the very bare minimum with them. That's weird. That's not what we've learned within Christianity. We have learned, don't do anything bad, be okay, keep your nose clean and everything will be okay. And he's saying, no, I want you to take risks. You have something that I have given you, and I want you to go and do it. Benjamin Franklin says, hide not your talents. They were for use, right? They were for use. They were for you to make something. It was for you to make. What good is a sundial in the shade? And God has given you guys so many great gifts. What is good if you aren't using them for it? It's like that childhood saying of hide it under a bushel. No, I'm going to let it shine. We look in verse 15 and it says, to one he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The master gives no direction as to how they were to invest the capital. Out of their respective experiences and places of power, they were to go about making their investments. The assignment was an opportunity to increase the value of the household. Though each was different, each was given an opportunity. The text, each according to his ability, may be better read as each according to his own power or social position. The master, who understood each servant, gave them an opportunity he believed they could manage within the time he was away. In verse 16 it says, the man who had received the 5 talents went out and at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. The phrase went out at once put his money to work suggests that he worked with talents at his disposal, and in this case it will mean specifically that he engaged in business, although the listener is not told in what kind. He gets the thing and he says, okay, I know that the master has given me much. And as we've learned in in this verse, to much is given, much is required. If you have been faithful over little, he says, I'll give you over more and more. And you might be thinking today and saying, well, what does this have to do with me? What does it have to do with the things that God has given me? And I would say this, I would say we have to look at the things that God has given us, and we have to say, are we using them? And there's a couple of things that I want to look at. So it is an important question to ask, is this: what has God placed me? What has God placed in me that matters so much to God? Okay, if I'm going to be judged on how I've used these talents, wouldn't it be helpful to know what God is talking about? Here's a sampling of what some of the gifts may be. The first thing is, the very fact that I'm a human being is remarkable. In Genesis, we learn that we are made in the Imago Dei. And do you know what the Imago Dei means? The image of God. Yes. And the image of God gives you value, dignity, and worth, right? It gives you the sense of being made not only unique, but we are made with his imprint on us. We've talked about this before. When they were trying to grab Jesus and trick Jesus with a good question, the Pharisee says, should we give money away? Should we give our money to the taxes to Caesar? And he takes and he says, does anybody have a coin? And, yeah, I have a coin. And here's the coin. And he says, whose face is on that coin? And he says, well, it's Caesar's face. And he says, well, I want you to give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Now, see, this is actually supposed to bring us to the understanding of the Imago Dei, because the Imago Dei is saying that whose image do you bear? Well, we bear the image of God. Well, then give, earthly wealth and earthly possession and earthly currency back to the earthly kingdoms and the earthly kings and give to God what is his currency. What is God's currency? What is God's wealth? How God sees wealth is not by monetary things or money or bricks of gold, but his wealth is based upon the people that bear his image. And sadly, we do not see it that way. We don't see it that way. We don't see that the image of God is imprinted on each one of us, and our wealth is not determined by how much money that we have, but our wealth is determined by how many relationships that we have, how we're connected, how we're loving, how we're serving, how we're giving to other people. See, all of these parables are constantly pointing to the generosity of Jesus, the generosity of God, that he has given us life, that he has given us his life. And that's another thing, especially living in a postmodern world, because we go out into San Francisco and we meet incredible people every day. Every day we'll meet somebody that is incredibly kind, incredibly talented, wonderful, awesome. Yes, flawed. Yes, we can get mad, we can get upset. But sometimes we'll come into contact and be like, I can't imagine that this person, if they don't believe in Jesus, isn't gonna go to heaven. And that rubs us the wrong way, and we go, well, I thought they were sinners. I thought they were evil. I thought they were horrible people. Why is there this kind of break? Why is there this kind of interruption, so to speak, between what is a Christian and what not? Well, we have to see that we were all made in the Imago Dei. We're all made with this intrinsic value to do good. We were created for good works. We were created for good things. And the problem isn't that people are more evil than us because we are saved. It is that we are recognizing that we're made in the image, and we're not just made for ourselves, but we're made for others. And that's kind of the point. The point that I want us to get to and understand the wealth of is that we're made in the Imago Dei, that we're given this life. That's what God has put us here for. That God of creation fashioned us to resemble the divine essence. That we aren't a cheap reproduction stamped out of God's cosmic factory. We humans are divinely designed gifts in this world. Secondly, as we are different by the way of personality, we are also different by the way of talents. The imagery is that God has deposited gifts that are differential in each of us, gifts that have potential for good in God's world. Also, we see the older that we get, that we will realize that one of the most important commodities of life is time, right? Rick Warren, I don't really ever quote Rick Warren that much, but I loved this one thing that I saw in one of his books. He says this: time is your most precious gift because you only have a set amount of it. You can make more money, but you can't make more time. When you give someone your time, you are giving them a portion of your life that you'll never get back. Your time is your life. That is why the greatest gift you can give someone is your time. It is not enough just to say your relationships are important. We must prove it by investing time in them. Words alone are worthless. My children, it says, our love should not be just words and talk. It must be true love, which shows itself in action. Relationships take time and effort, and the best way to spell love is Time. So we see all of these things, and we see that the master goes away, and Jesus comes back, and he says, "What have you done with this?" So quickly, as we get to the strength of the sermon, we see, how should we wait? What should we do? And why should we risk it? See, like Jesus' disciples, we await his return. So how should we wait? Well, we should wait with the gifts that God has invested in us. What has God gifted you in? Creatively, if you're a creative person, how is that for the sake of the gospel? I've talked about this before, but I'm going to talk about it again because it's my time to talk. See that? Lord of the Rings, right? J.R.R. Tolkien. Have you guys heard of Tolkien? Of course you have. You've been coming to church here for a while. You're going to hear a lot of Tolkien. How he used to write was different than Lewis, right? I love both of them. They're great guys, right? You got C.S. Lewis, you got Tolkien. They used to meet in this bar called the Eagle and Child, and they would just talk and shape pretty much not just Christian theology, but these amazing stories. They went against the grain. I mean, honestly, fantasy and science fiction, I know that people have a problem with science fiction and calling Lord of the Rings that, but they really paved the way and went against the grain so that many people could understand and have these things that we love in blockbusters, whatever. This is the difference between Tolkien and Lewis. See, Tolkien would write in the meta-narrative. He would write in the major story and understanding. That's why he had, he would create this whole new world, and he would create it in big parts. And each story had a story, but it was also always about this bigger arc and this greater thing. And Lewis, how he would write his fantasy, they always kind of had a point, right? It was like the difference. It was like, I have a really great idea, and then I'm going to make kind of art out of that. And then Tolkien thought that was kind of cheap because he would be like, no, I'm not going to have Aslan be Jesus. He's like, he basically patted Lewis on the head and said this should be a children's book, and it became a children's book, and it made a lot of money. That's all because of Tolkien. And so you have Tolkien, you have Lewis, and Tolkien was more, I'm just going to do my art and let it flow freely out of me. And at the end, everyone's like, oh man, this is a great idea. This is a great thing. He's like, yeah, I was just kind of letting it flow through me. And he says, this is the reason why. He said, the reason why it has to be like that is this. I believe in the gospel. And what he meant by the gospel is he meant that the gospel is this. God created us for a love relationship. We fell into sin. Then we were redeemed. And after we were redeemed, we were going to live forever with him. This is the meta-narrative. This is the huge story that Tolkien said. And he said, I'm just going to let this be in who I am. And through that, it's just going to bleed out. It's going to bleed out. And what we see is we see a whole bunch of characters, instead of one character, like in C.S. Lewis's book, which is Aslan, which is Jesus, you have 7. You have Aragorn as the returning king. I know I'm boring you to death, but there's a point in all this. Aragorn is the returning king. You have Frodo as a suffering servant. You have Samwise Gamgee as the friend that sticks closer than a brother. You have all these characters, and when people came up to him and said, oh, I see it now, he's like, I didn't mean for it to be like that at all. He just said that I live my life in such a way that the gospel bleeds out of me in whatever I do. Whether it is like Martin Luther, in the garden, raking in the garden. He says, in everything that I do, it just bleeds out of me. And so many times, we in the Christian world have tried to do the opposite, right? We are saying, okay, God has created me in music, so I have to be in a Christian band. And it has to be incredibly Christian, and it has to only be played on Christian radio, and that's it. It's ridiculous. No, you were created for so much more than that. The gospel comes into who you are and whatever flows out of you. Hey, if you are a worship leader and you want to create worship songs, that's going to just flow out of you and it's just going to happen. But you don't stifle the giftings that God has just so that you could be a part of this idea of Christianity. This is why I love Tolkien. Tolkien said, "You have made me a writer, God. I'm going to hide who you have made me. I'm going to hide the gospel into who I am, and I'm just going to let it come out." And you can say, "Josh, I don't know how that works within my 9-to-5 job." But this is the thing. Jesus says this. He came in they call it the incarnation, right? And they get that word carne, right, from kind of, carne asada, steak tacos, right? Jesus came in the form of flesh, right? God, he had the whole gospel narrative. He had the whole thing in who he was, right? He believed in the love of God, and he put on human flesh, and he loved, he served, and he died. And whatever God has created you to be, whatever God has made you to be, you have to realize that it has to flow through you. So as we wait, we have to see the gifts that God has invested into us. And we are invested with his power, helping us do what Christ expects from us. So how should we wait? We should wait in understanding who we are. We need to understand the giftings that God has given us, and we have to realize that we can only be shaped by the community that God has put around us. And how are you doing with that? Have you ever asked and thought, how might I invest my life in not only the church, but in other people around us? I look at, the people that we have here, and I just constantly think of, what would it look like as a community that says, I'm going to invest outside of myself and not put it, and just do the bare minimum, but I'm going to invest into other people and what that would maybe look like. Secondly, we see this. What should we do? Christ will return and review what we have done with our gifts. Those who have served by risking will be praised, right? Those who have taken what they have and said, you know what, I can love a little bit. I could be humble in this. For those of you that have a kind of a little bit more high-powered job that you actually kind of need to step on other people to get ahead, this is a little bit harder. Right? Because when you're in that mode constantly, you're constantly trying to, push others down and look and see how I can excel forward. Right? And so what Jesus is saying is he's saying it is in those ways that God is calling me to invest in others and others growing. But that's not just to say if someone's a bad worker and you're like, oh, I'm really going to just help them. That's not helping them to, push this bad worker ahead. But what I'm saying is there's going to be times in your life that for the sake of the gospel, you're going to have to humble yourself so others can go further. You're going to have to take risks in those ways. But you're going to have to take risks and with your integrity. You're going to have to take risks with your time. We've just talked about how time is one of the most precious and most wonderful things that you can have, and that's just true within Christianity as a whole. It took time for you guys to wake up and come here on Sunday morning. It took time. And the things that we prioritize that are greatest in our lives, we give the most time to. But just as we saw in the beginning, is if Jesus was coming back tomorrow, which I know that sounds like something, or, for everyone, that day is closer than we actually know. We can walk outside the door, and God forbid, but we could get hit by a car because people drive crazy, especially Uber drivers. No offense if you're an Uber driver. Go Lyft. No. But, you just don't know. Every day is a day where you're just like, okay, it could be my last. And am I living my life in accordance to that? Are you? Do you have to take stock and take an investment? So as we wait for God's return, what do? We need to take an assessment of the things that God has given us, right? I've talked about the 5 capitals before of our lives: relational, emotional, physical, right? We have relational. I think I said physical. I think it's like financial. But the whole kind of concept of our lives, we need to say, are we investing those things well and for God's kingdom? But this is the thing that I really want to get to, because Lewis has a problem with us just investing a little bit and being only a little bit risky with what the things that we have, right? He has a problem with this. This is what Lewis says, even though I just smashed him down. When he just wrote nonfiction books, it was way better. No offense to all you Narnians, but it was just way better when it was nonfiction. He says this. This is what God says to you. Give me all of you. I don't want so much of your time, just a little of your time, so much of your talents and money, and so much of your work. I want you. All of you. I have not come to torment or frustrate the natural man or woman, but to kill it. No half measures will do. I don't have to only prune a branch here and a branch there. Rather, I want the whole tree out. Hand it over to me, the whole outfit, all of our desires, all of our wants, wishes, and dreams. Turn them all over to me. Give yourself to me, and I will make of you a new self in my image. Give me yourself, and in exchange, I will give you myself. My will shall become your will. My heart shall become your heart. Lastly, why should we risk it? There is an awful consequence for those who bury their opportunities of faith. See, the great sin in our lives right now is unfaith. Unfaith. It's not doubt. Doubt is basically like fuel to faith. I love doubt. You should struggle with your doubt. You should learn with your doubt. You should be incredibly uncomfortable with doubt, because doubt is doubt is kind of like hay, right? It's like this hay, and there's a whole bunch of it, and it's here or there, and you can take that and you can bring it to the hot, burning fire of faith, and what it does is it grows it more and more. How we've thought of faith, or not faith, what we've thought of doubt for much of our lives is we've seen it like water or like ice that douses the flame, and sometimes it could be that way. Sometimes a whole bunch of hay going over a little bit of flame can kill it. But more often than not, if you could have an understanding of doubt, and you can study, and you can live within the balance of understanding and saying, I have doubts. Yeah, there isn't a day that goes by that sometimes I say, man, is this whole thing real? Am I just a butterfly dreaming that I am a man preaching at a church? Yeah, don't think about that too much. You know, like, what is this life? But the more that you worship God, the more that you pray, the more that I look at people, and I'm just so amazed by the talents and the giftings that God has given them. It is to that degree that I realize and say, no, this thing is real, and I will struggle, and I will doubt. And that true unfaith is apathy, just not caring about anything or anyone, not willing to make risks, taking the things that God has given me and just hiding them away, and not even putting them in a bank, not even doing a little, doing even something that could give some interest. We just say, no, I'm just going to put it away. And Lewis says, God doesn't want just a little bit of your time. He doesn't want a little bit of your money. He doesn't want a little bit of the things that you are excited about or your passions and desires. He wants all of it. And he's coming for all of it. He is an all-consuming fire. He wants you. He wants me. And he wants us for himself. He says, I want to exchange your will and your life for my everlasting life and my everlasting will. And if Jesus was going to come back today, would that be enough for you? Are you risking for the kingdom? Are you like these guys that had a whole huge amount of money and just said, you know what? I became a Christian. I'm going to take what God has given me. I'm going to put it away. And I'm just going to do my own life, do my own things. And when God returns, when he comes back, I go and get the investment, which is the Holy Spirit. And I come back to him and I said, here you go. And he goes, no, that's not Christianity. That's not your lives. I don't want just some of you. I want all of you. This parable is huge. Why? Because when he's talking about the kingdom of God, when he's talking to us about the thing of this new reign, he's saying, I want you to realize that all of your allegiances and all the things that you thought you needed and you thought were prevalent in your life, they are just not. They are just little things that aren't about what I have called you to do, which is be a person that invests in my kingdom. And how do we invest in our kingdoms, or into God's kingdom? By investing into his church, investing into each other, investing into the next life, not just this one. See, we talked last week a little bit about the great exchange, that Jesus is my righteousness and I am his sin. He became something that I was not so that I could become something that I am not. Last week we were looking and saying, it doesn't matter what you do, it's all about what Jesus has done. This week, it's all about looking at the risk of Jesus coming from heaven to earth and looking and saying, what would we risk for us to go from earth to heaven? What would we risk? What would we do? Would we allow ourselves to cut out a little bit more of my time so I can serve? To cut out a little bit more of my time so I can get coffee with this person? Can I cut out a little bit more of my time so that I can wake up early in the morning? Can I cut out my whole life in saying, I am a vessel for you, God, and you are not a vessel for me? See, that is the problem. He is saying you are in a relationship with a person. You're not in a relationship with some force in the world that is non-personal. He says, I want all of you, just as me and my wife and people that are married, they say, I don't want just a little bit of time here and there. I want all of you. I want your whole attention. And Jesus is saying, I want all of you, and I want even the risky side of you. And that is a good thing. Don't be lazy. So, during worship, we're going to be eating of the blood and of the body. And the blood and the body that was broken for us was one of the riskiest things that ever happened. We realized that when Jesus was crucified on the cross that day on Golgotha, he was realizing that he was risking his relationship with his own Father, right? So this is huge. When Jesus was bleeding in Gethsemane, do you guys remember when he bled great drops of blood, when he was praying God's will, and he said, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done? The reason why he was bleeding was because it was the first time that he was not being able to be connected to the Father, the first time that he was not going to be in communion with God, and how we every single day say, hey, I will give you this much of my life. I will only invest this much of my time. I will only invest this much. I won't be very risky for what you have done. And it is because we haven't seen the risk of heaven, the risk of Jesus Christ, the risk of his Son, that he said, I would rather bleed to death than be apart from you. But at the very moment he said, it's not my will, it's your will to be done, he goes on the cross, and for the first time in all of history, God turned his face from his Son so that you and I could experience his love and his life and his goodness. And it is within the risk of Jesus that we get the reward of heaven. And because of that, because all of the risk was done, that we are people that do not have to worry about the sting of death any longer, right? That's where the risks come in, right? What is, when you do risk management, it's all about your life. But if the sting of death is no longer there for the Christian because Jesus tasted the sting of death, that means that everything that we do, everything that we risk is only a reward. There's no more sting because Jesus took that sting of death. Look at me, everyone. I know you already are, but look at me. Look at me. He wants all of you. He wants your whole life. He wants to be just bleeding in every situation, every desire that you have. He wants all of you. And he wants it for his kingdom. And he is doing it because he is good. So as we worship is a sign of saying, I'm going to lose myself and I'm going to find you, God. I'm going to give everything up in this moment and risk myself looking in a perfect composure or a posture that I want other people to do, and I'm just going to lose myself in you. I'm going to respond to you and saying, God, this week I'm going to risk so much more. I'm going to risk, and just, for, not being weird, I don't ever risk and say, hey, you need Jesus to someone. That just seems cheesy. It doesn't seem like it's a relationship, but that's what Jesus did. Every time someone was lacking something, he said to them, you need Jesus. But that was so risky. Why? Because, that's just not a cool thing to say. Or meeting with people and saying, man, you need to know that you have grace in your life right now. But the thing is so many of us need to hear grace from other people besides me, but we don't see that God has brought us on this mission, that he is using us for his will. This parable is meant to convict you. The power is in the hearer, and to the degree that you hear this is to the degree that you're going to act this week. I'm not saying you are not saved by your works. You're saved by the risk of heaven, the risk of Jesus. You're saved by that. But now he's saying, now go and do more. Live generously. Live recklessly for him. Let's pray. God, we come before you this morning and we just thank you so much for how good you are, how kind you are. And Father, I just want to pray right now for those in here that know that they could be giving more. They know they could be giving more of their life. And I pray that they would stop that thinking and they would start thinking that how can they give their whole life for you? It's risky. We have doubts. But let them know that they're in good company because Jesus was risky. And he had doubts, saying, if there would be any other way, please remove the cup from me. I do not want to be separated from you. But he knew that there was no other way. That without the shedding of blood, there could be no redemption or forgiveness of sins. That the separatedness of our hearts and our lives from the one that has the source of life had become too great. That the only thing that could transform us was the death of God's Son. So as we worship you today, could we trust you with our lives, trust you with our jobs, trust you with our passions? Because the things that you take away from us with your right hand, you're giving it back to us with your left. You always do that. You always want us to allow you to take the precious things from us, and then you refine those things for your work, for your good. And may we realize that the good of God is truly the good of us, that we are too short-sighted. Lord, we thank you for this morning. Let us worship in spirit and in truth. In your name.